Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You guys requested this one a lot, and I gotta say, at first I thought this one's gonna be a little dry. But the more I got into it, well, let's just say it's a lot more interesting than it sounds at first.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So basically, today we're diving into how criminal networks are they're using legal businesses to their advantage. I mean, it's like something straight out of like a crime thriller or something.
It really is.
So to guide us through this whole thing, we've got a brand new report from Europol. It just came out last month, actually.
Cut off the presses.
It's called Leveraging Legitimacy, and basically we're going to break down the what, how, and the why of this whole threat. So no matter if you're a business owner or just a consumer or just someone who wants to be in the know, this one's for you. And I got to say, one of the things that I found most shocking.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of shocking stuff in this report. I mean, one of the things that really jumps out is that 86% of the EU's most dangerous criminal networks are actually involved in this. Like, they're exploiting what Europol calls legal business structures, or LBS.
Okay, wait, hold on. Legal business structure. That sounds really broad. What exactly are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's not just like big corporations or something like that. Think about any framework that makes a business legal. So that could be a limited liability company, a sole proprietorship, partnerships, even trusts.
Okay, so all the regular stuff you'd think of when you think of businesses.
Exactly.
So why are these structures so appealing to criminals? Is it just like, so they can look more legit, or is there...
Well, looking legitimate is a huge part of it, for sure. I mean, it helps them stay under the radar, but it's not just about looking legit, though. It also gives them access to all sorts of resources like bank accounts, loans, even government subsidies.
Oh, wow. So they can actually use this to, like, blend in with the legitimate businesses and, like, access things they shouldn't be able to.
Exactly. It's all about blending in. They can move money around, they can import and export goods, and they can even recruit victims for exploitation, all under the guise of a legal business.
That's really scary. And I remember reading in the report about different levels of this, right? Like how some businesses are totally in the dark about how they're being used by criminals.
Oh, absolutely. Europol actually outlines 3 distinct levels of infiltration. The first one they call unknowing use. So imagine for a second a shipping company, totally legitimate, right? But they have no idea that some criminal ring is using their containers to transport drugs.
So they're basically just providing a service and have no idea they're part of this bigger...
They're completely unwitting participants.
Oh, wow. So it's possible that companies we interact with every day could be caught up in something like that, and they would have no idea.
It happens more often than you think, unfortunately. And then there's what they call low-level infiltration. So in this scenario, maybe a couple employees at a business are complicit, maybe they've been coerced or something, but the higher-ups are completely clueless. You can imagine like a bank teller, maybe they're being pressured to funnel small amounts of money into a criminal account.
So it's like those classic stories about a rogue employee, but on a much bigger scale, potentially.
Right, exactly. But the thing that's really the most worrying is what they call high-level infiltration. That's where things get really, really shadowy.
Okay, so this is where we get into like the real spy thriller stuff. Tell me more about this high-level infiltration.
Okay, so this is where like key individuals within a business are compromised. They're willingly working with criminals. Or, and this is even scarier, the entire business was set up from the very beginning as a front for criminal activity.
Oh, wow. So they're not even trying to hide it at that point. It's just built in from the ground up.
Exactly. And you want to know the really scary part? The report says that a full 63% of the most threatening networks are operating at this level.
63%. That's a huge number. So we're not just talking about like small-time crooks here. These are like sophisticated operations that are deeply embedded in the business world.
Oh, absolutely. And they're involved in a much wider range of crimes than you might think.
Okay, well, let's unpack some of those crimes. The report mentioned fraud as being a big one. What kind of fraud are we talking about here?
Well, fraud is actually a prime example of a crime that really relies on exploiting legal business structures. Take, for example, VAT fraud. You might have heard of this, called carousel fraud.
Carousel fraud. That sounds more like an amusement park ride than a crime. How does that even work in the business world?
So picture this. You've got goods being shuffled between different companies, like they're on a carousel, and the whole point of this is to evade taxes.
So they're like moving stuff around just to make it look like it's...
They make it really hard to follow the money. There's this missing trader, and they basically disappear after charging VAT, but they don't pay it to the government. Then you've got these buffer companies that are just there to create distance. And then finally, you've got a broker who ends up claiming a VAT refund that shouldn't even exist.
It sounds incredibly complicated.
Oh, it is. It's incredibly complicated. The whole thing is designed to confuse investigators and make it almost impossible to track the money. And this report has some crazy examples of this. Do you remember that case where they had that just ridiculous number of companies set up for just one single fraud scheme?
Oh, yeah. Wasn't it something like...
It was a network that created 76 companies, all for a single VAT fraud scheme.
76 companies. That's like a whole shadow network of companies just to pull off one scam.
And it's not just limited to one type of product or industry, right? Like the report mentioned fraud happening all across the board.
Yeah, it really runs the gamut. Electronics, food, drinks, even intangible goods like online services are being targeted.
Wow, so they're not picky at all. Not at all. And it's not just VAT fraud either. We're talking about subsidy fraud where they're, claiming government funds they're not entitled to.
Oh, right.
Food fraud where they're slipping, maybe toxic ingredients into the supply chain, even mortgage fraud. It's all about exploiting the system for profit.
So this isn't just happening in like shady back alleys or anything. This is happening in plain sight, in industries that touch our lives every single way.
Exactly. And one of the most disturbing aspects of this is how it's affecting us online.
Right, because these days, everyone's online, so it's a prime target for criminals, isn't it?
It is. Think about all those investment scams you see popping up all the time. Tech support cons, fake online stores. They all need some kind of business structure, some kind of facade to law legitimate. And all those shady call centers where scammers try to steal your information?
Oh, yeah, the ones that tell you that you've won a cruise or something, and you're like, I don't even remember entering that contest.
Exactly. And what's crazy? Sometimes the employees in those call centers don't even know that they're working for a criminal operation. It's all designed to look like a legitimate business.
Oh, wow. That makes it even more effective, right? Because they're not even aware that they're part of this.
Exactly. They're just doing their job. And then there's this thing called business email compromise.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
This is where hackers will actually impersonate real companies to try to steal money.
So they're like hijacking the trust that we have in these businesses.
Exactly. They're really good at it, too. And we can't forget about digital skimming. That one's terrifying because it can target both online businesses and customers.
Yeah, that one's scary because you order something online and you think you're on a legitimate website and then all of a sudden your credit card details are stolen.
Right. And you don't even know it's happened sometimes until it's too late.
It could happen to any of us, really. Okay, so we've talked about fraud. We've talked about online fraud. What about cybercrime in general? How are criminal networks using legal businesses in the world of cybercrime?
Well, cyber criminals actually rely on legitimate businesses in a way. Think about it. They need things like servers, websites, even cloud services, all of which are provided by legitimate companies. And they need all this to launch their attacks, distribute malware, and carry out their schemes.
So they're basically piggybacking off of the infrastructure that's already been built by legitimate businesses.
Exactly. They're exploiting the tools and resources that are essential for doing business online.
So it's like a double-edged sword. Technology makes our lives easier, but it also creates new opportunities for criminals to exploit.
Exactly. We won't get too deep into the technical details here, but just know that a lot of cybercrime relies on exploiting legitimate businesses in some way.
Okay, so we've uncovered a pretty disturbing picture of how these criminal networks operate. It's clear that they've infiltrated a vast number of industries, and they're exploiting everyday businesses for their own gain.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
I have a feeling things are about to get even darker, aren't they?
Yes, unfortunately, some even more serious crimes are being committed using this method.
Well, let's dive into those next then. What else is this report revealing about this hidden world of criminal networks and businesses?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the hidden world of criminal networks.
In part one, we really started to unpack how these networks are using, those legitimate businesses, the LBS, to carry out all sorts of crimes, from fraud and cybercrime to even some more serious offenses. And it's pretty alarming, really. This is happening globally, across industries, and often right under our noses.
It's a vast and interconnected web of criminal activity, and it really has some profound implications for all of us.
That's exactly what I wanted to explore in this part of our deep dive. We've seen how they operate, but what does it actually mean for, individuals, businesses, society as a whole? What are the real-world consequences of all this?
Well, the consequences are significant, that's for sure, and they're far-reaching. On a societal level, imagine the foundation of trust that we all rely on, just chipped away bit by bit.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
It
You
is.
start to wonder, well, what's really going on and who can you trust? And are the systems that we rely on really working as they should?
Exactly. And that erosion of trust has a ripple effect. It can stifle economic growth, discourage investment, and even influence government policies. It creates an environment where corruption can thrive and makes it really hard for honest businesses to compete.
It's almost like they're playing a game with a different set of rules.
It is. It really is.
And some of the players have, cheat codes or something that the others don't even know about.
That's a great analogy.
So it's not just like a theoretical problem or something. This has a real impact on jobs, livelihoods, the overall health of the economy.
Oh, absolutely.
But I want to bring it down to a more personal level, though. How does this infiltration of criminal networks affect individuals, like you and me?
Well, for individuals, the impact can be really direct and very real. We already talked a little bit about human trafficking, but this can be hidden within these seemingly legitimate businesses, which means that people, often vulnerable individuals, are being exploited right under our noses. And as consumers, we might unknowingly be interacting with businesses that are actually profiting from this exploitation.
It's a pretty chilling thought when you realize that this isn't just happening in some far-off place. This could be happening in our own communities, even in businesses that we frequent.
Exactly. And then there's the financial impact. Think about all those different types of fraud that we talked about: VAT fraud, investment scams, online fraud, mortgage fraud. All these schemes can financially devastate individuals, leading to bankruptcy, identity theft.
And just that overall loss of trust in the system.
It is scary to think that you could just be going about your day, interacting with businesses that you believe are legitimate, and then suddenly find yourself caught up in some criminal scheme. It's a real threat to our financial security.
And even when these schemes are exposed, recovering your losses or seeing those perpetrators brought to justice, it can be really difficult. The system is often slow to respond, and those criminals are always, one step ahead. They're looking for new ways to exploit loopholes and stay ahead of the law.
They are. It's a constant cat and mouse game.
Okay, so we've talked about the societal impact. We've talked about the impact on individuals. But what about the businesses themselves? How are they being affected by this infiltration of criminal networks? Are they always the victims, or can they be complicit as well?
That's a really complex question. In some cases, businesses are definitely unwitting victims, just caught in the crossfire of criminal activity. But in other cases, they might be complicit, either knowingly or through negligence.
Oh, wow. So it's not always black and white.
It really isn't. The implications for businesses can range from, reputational damage and financial losses to legal consequences and even threats of violence from these networks.
Let's break that down a little bit. What are some of the specific ways that businesses can be harmed?
Well, reputational damage is a big one. Even if a business is unknowingly involved in some kind of criminal activity, just being associated with it can be really damaging to their reputation. Consumers might boycott their products or services, investors might pull out, and business partners might cut ties. The impact on the brand can be really significant, and it can last for a really long time.
Yeah, it's hard to shake that association once it's out there, even if they are cleared of any wrongdoing.
Exactly. And then you've got financial losses, obviously. Businesses can lose money directly through fraud, theft, even just having to invest in expensive security measures to try to protect themselves from these networks.
So it's not just about the immediate financial hit. It's about the long-term damage to their stability and profitability.
Exactly. And of course, there are also the legal consequences that businesses need to worry about. Even if a business is totally unaware of the criminal activity happening within their operations, they can still face fines, penalties, or even criminal charges if it's found that they were negligent in their oversight.
It's a lot of responsibility for business owners, especially in today's world.
It is.
Everything's so complex and interconnected. It's almost impossible to keep track of every single transaction and interaction, especially as businesses grow.
You're right. But there are cases where businesses actually face much more serious consequences than just fines or penalties. We're talking about things like threats, intimidation, and even violence from these networks.
So it's not just like white-collar crime happening in boardrooms or something like that.
No.
There's a real element of danger and physical threat involved as well.
Oh, absolutely. These networks are ruthless, and they will not hesitate to use intimidation or violence to protect their interests and to silence anyone who might try to expose their operations.
It's a chilling reminder that we're not just talking about financial crimes here. We're talking about organized crime with all the dangers that come with it. It's something that businesses really need to be aware of and take steps to protect themselves from.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that this is an issue that affects all of us, from individuals to businesses to society as a whole.
Okay, so we've really explored the dark side of this hidden world. The implications are vast, the consequences are real, and the threats are serious. I know it's easy to feel overwhelmed by, just the scale and complexity of it all, but there's more to the story, right? We can't just leave our listeners with this sense of doom and gloom.
You're absolutely right. It's a complex problem, but it's not insurmountable. There are a lot of people and organizations out there fighting back, developing strategies and solutions to try to combat this threat.
Well, that's what I want to hear more about. In the final part of our deep dive, let's shift our focus from the problems to the solutions. What can be done to fight back against this infiltration and protect our communities? Welcome back, deep divers. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we?
We have.
Really taking a deep dive into this unsettling world of criminal networks and how they're infiltrating legitimate businesses.
We've uncovered some, well, pretty disturbing stuff, really peeled back the layers to see how deep these networks are embedded in our global economy.
Yeah, and we talked about the very real dangers they pose and what it means for all of us, really.
Right, for individuals, businesses, and societies as a whole.
But now, in this final part of our deep dive, I kind of want to shift gears a little.
Yeah.
We've talked about the problems, but what about the solutions?
Yeah, good point.
It's easy to feel, I don't know, kind of powerless when you see something this widespread, but I'm really hoping that you can give us some insight into what's being done to fight back.
Absolutely. And what's really encouraging is that there is growing awareness of this problem. Governments, law enforcement agencies, international organizations, even businesses themselves are stepping up to try to combat this.
Okay, well, let's dive into that then. What are some of the key strategies and solutions that are being developed?
Right.
Where do we even begin to tackle something this complex?
Well, a good starting point is to strengthen our legal frameworks. We need to close the loopholes that criminals are exploiting, make it much harder for them to hide behind these legitimate business structures.
So make it riskier for them.
Yeah.
Make the cost higher.
Exactly. Tougher regulations, increased penalties, all that can act as a deterrent.
So make the cost of doing business in the criminal world a lot higher.
Exactly.
But strong laws are just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Sure.
You need robust law enforcement too.
Oh, absolutely. Law enforcement is key. And that means equipping those agencies with the resources they need, the training they need to properly investigate these complex crimes. And we also need international cooperation. That's vital when we're dealing with these cross-border networks.
Yeah, because it's not like crime stops at the border anymore, right? It's all interconnected.
Not at all.
So you really need to have those global connections to combat it.
Right. We need to break down those silos that we've created, foster information sharing, and work together. And, technology plays a really big role here, too. We can leverage all sorts of cutting-edge tools to track financial flows and uncover those hidden connections.
Yeah, like all that data analysis and artificial intelligence, all that stuff. So it's like we're entering a new era of crime fighting, really, where technology is just as important as those traditional investigative techniques.
Absolutely.
And speaking of connecting the dots, what about intelligence gathering and analysis? How can we enhance that?
Well, that's absolutely crucial, too. We need to be able to identify those businesses that might be vulnerable. And again, data analysis can help spot those suspicious patterns. And AI can actually sift through massive amounts of data to identify potential threats.
So we're not just playing catch up. We're trying to get ahead of them.
Exactly.
Predict their moves and stop them before they can even start.
We need to move from a reactive approach to a proactive one.
Okay.
And that brings us to another key element: prevention. We need to raise awareness among businesses about the risks they face, give them the tools they need to protect themselves, and encourage them to report any suspicious activity they encounter.
So make them part of the solution, really, not just potential victims.
Exactly. Empower them. Because, businesses have these insights and this on-the-ground knowledge that law enforcement often lacks. They're really on the front lines.
Right. They see it firsthand.
They do. And by working together, sharing information, and implementing strong security measures, we can make it much harder for criminals to actually exploit these legitimate businesses.
Right? Because they're the ones that see it first, oftentimes. Okay, so we've talked about strengthening the laws. We've talked about bolstering law enforcement. We've talked about enhancing intelligence gathering. We've talked about empowering businesses. Are there any specific initiatives or organizations that are kind of spearheading this whole fight?
Yeah, there are some really encouraging developments out there. For instance, you've got the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF.
I've heard of them.
They set those global standards for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. They provide recommendations for countries to follow, and they're constantly conducting evaluations to make sure that everyone is in compliance.
So they're like the financial watchdogs of the world,
Exactly.
making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Right. And then, of course, there's Europol. We've already mentioned them. They play a really crucial role in coordinating all these cross-border law enforcement operations, sharing information, and providing expertise to all those national agencies.
So again, it's that collaboration piece.
It is.
Nobody can solve this problem on their own.
You're absolutely right. It takes a unified front, a global effort. And on a regional level, you've got initiatives like the European Multidisciplinary Platform Against Criminal Threats, or MPACT.
That's a mouthful.
It is. This platform basically brings together law enforcement, judicial authorities, and other stakeholders to tackle these specific crime areas, including the ones that involve businesses.
So it's like a targeted approach, really.
Yeah.
Focusing your resources and expertise on a specific threat.
Exactly. And there's a growing number of private organizations joining the fight, too. Some specialize in, financial intelligence, providing data and analytics to help banks and businesses prevent money laundering.
Oh, that's great. So the private sector is getting involved, too.
They are. They're seeing how this affects them as well.
That's good.
And then there are others that focus on raising awareness among businesses and providing training on those security measures that we talked about.
It's great to see all this collective action coming together. But I know for our listeners who are probably feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this, what can they do? What are some simple, actionable steps that people can take to protect themselves and their businesses? What can they do right now?
That's a great question, and it's an important one. Well, first and foremost, you've got to stay informed. Be aware of the different types of scams and schemes that are out there. Be cautious about who you trust, and be mindful of the information that you're sharing, both personally and professionally.
So it's about being a savvy consumer and a cautious business owner.
Exactly.
Not falling for those classic traps.
Right. And be proactive about your own security. If you own a business, implement some strong cybersecurity measures, do those regular audits, and train your employees to spot and report any kind of suspicious activity. And as individuals, protect your personal information, be careful what you share online, and use those strong passwords and two-factor authentication whenever possible.
It sounds like taking ownership of our own security, both online and offline, is really key.
It is.
We can't just rely on others to protect us.
Right. And one final point, and this is so important, don't be afraid to report suspicious activity. If something feels off, trust your instincts and report it to the authorities. You might be the missing piece that helps law enforcement uncover a whole criminal network, or maybe even prevent someone from becoming a victim.
Wow, that's powerful. We're not powerless bystanders in this fight.
No, we're not.
By being aware, being proactive, and speaking up, we can make a real difference.
Absolutely, we can.
This deep dive has been, it's been fascinating, I'll admit. A little unsettling at times.
It is a dark subject.
It is, but it's also been really empowering, I think.
It has. This deep dive, we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, I feel like we could talk about this for hours.
We could.
But hopefully this has piqued your curiosity, given you some food for thought, and maybe even empowered you to take action.
That's the goal.
It certainly has for me. We've journeyed into a world that most of us didn't even know existed. But as you said, it's a fight worth fighting, and we all have a role to play. So to our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking those questions, and keep the conversation going. This fight against criminal infiltration, it's ongoing, and it really requires a collective effort. By working together, by sharing information, and by staying vigilant, we can protect ourselves, our businesses, and our communities from this very real threat. Until next time, Deep Dive fans, stay curious and stay safe.